Please, sell the house. I know what I'm asking. Just do it before I change my mind.
You gave me back my daughter. I've spent years learning how to deserve you.
6 years ago, I sold the only house my late parents left me in Nigeria to save a dying Korean girl I'd known for less than 24 hours. I was thousands of miles from home, with no family nearby, no one to talk me out of it. People said I'd lost my mind, that no child, no matter how sweet, was worth giving up the last piece of the country I came from. But I watched her count her own heartbeats out loud, too scared to close her eyes, and I couldn't walk away. I made the call to Enugu that night. By sunrise, I had sold the one thing that still made me feel like I belonged somewhere. Her father never got the chance to thank me. He vanished before I could tell him it was me. I told myself that chapter was closed. Then last week, a convoy of black cars stopped outside the one-room apartment I now rent in Seoul. A man stepped out of the rain, older, quieter, but I knew him instantly. He didn't bring money. He knelt on the wet pavement and opened a small black box. You gave me back my daughter. I've spent 6 years learning how to deserve you. The mansion floors gleamed under Naomi's cloth, but her mind was miles away, an ocean away, if she let herself think about it too long. Every evening after work, she returned to the small rented room that was nothing like the house her late parents had left her back in Enugu, the only place that had ever truly felt like home. She had come to Seoul years ago chasing work, telling herself she'd return one day, that the house would be waiting. It wasn't much, that house. It was every memory she had of being loved first, before the world asked anything of her. She scrubbed harder, as if hard work alone could silence the whispers around her. The other staff mocked her size, her plainness, the way she still smiled at children who weren't hers to love, and the way she didn't quite belong. Not fully Korean, not home either. She let them talk. Kindness was the only thing life hadn't managed to take from her. That afternoon she was sent to the private wing of St. Mary's Hospital to deliver linens, and that was where she found Ha-yoon, 6 years old, clutching a teddy bear, sobbing that she didn't want to go to sleep because she was scared she wouldn't wake up. No nurse could calm her. Naomi sat on the edge of the bed and hummed something her own mother used to sing under a different sky, and the girl finally quieted. "What's his name?" she asked, nodding at the bear. "Bori. Bori looks like he's been on a lot of adventures." The girl's lip trembled, but something in her shoulders loosened. Naomi told her a story about a bear who wasn't afraid of the dark because he carried a piece of sunlight in his chest, a story her own mother used to tell her under a different sky, in a different language, and when the story wasn't enough, she hummed the tune again until the girl's grip on the bear loosened and her eyes grew heavy. "Auntie," the girl murmured, right before sleep took her, "will you still be here?" Naomi didn't answer, because she didn't know. But she stayed until a nurse came to say it was time, and something about the 6-year-old's small, sleeping face had already lodged itself somewhere in her chest that she wouldn't be able to remove. Her name, Naomi learned from the chart at the foot of the bed, was Seo Ha-yoon. She wasn't supposed to return to that wing. She went anyway, the next day, on her lunch break, telling herself it would be the last time. It was in the hallway outside Ha-yoon's room that she first heard the doctors talking in the low, careful voices adults use when they think no one else is listening. The surgery was scheduled. The surgery was necessary. Without it, the doctor said, they were looking at weeks, not months. And the payment that had cleared only 2 days earlier had just been reversed, frozen along with every account belonging to Ha-yoon's father, a man the nurses only referred to in half-whispers, like saying his name too loudly might summon him. "He's tied up in something," one doctor murmured. "A war, from what I hear. Every asset frozen overnight. Until it clears, we can't proceed. And if it doesn't clear in time?" The silence that followed told Naomi everything the doctor was too careful to say out loud. She went home that night, to the single room she rented on the edge of the city, and sat at her small table with her bank passbook open in front of her, running the same 3 numbers over and over as if repetition might change them. It never did. She had enough for 2 more months of rent, maybe 3 if she stopped sending anything home to cover the empty house's taxes. She did not have enough for a child's heart. She thought about walking away. She told herself, lying in the dark that night, that Ha-Yun was not her daughter, not her family, not her responsibility, that she was a foreigner in this country with no one behind her if things went wrong, and there was no shame in a poor woman admitting the limits of what she had to give. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw a small girl asking if she would still be there. By morning she had her answer. She made the call to Enugu before she let herself change her mind, to a cousin who still lived near the old compound, and asked him to find a lawyer, to start the paperwork, to sell the only house her parents had ever given her. Her voice cracked twice on the phone. When it was done, she sat very still for a long time, holding a phone that had just carried away the last physical piece of her childhood, and felt the strange, hollow calm of a decision that could not be undone. The surgery went ahead 2 days later. Naomi wired the payment directly and asked, with a firmness that surprised even her, that her name never be attached to it. She didn't want thanks. She told herself she didn't want to know what the child's family would think of a foreign maid who gave away her home in another country for a stranger's daughter, whether they would call it generosity or foolishness, and she wasn't sure she could bear either answer. The money for the house arrived in her account 3 days later, wired across an ocean from a home she would now never return to. She transferred every last coin to the hospital and stood afterward with an empty balance and an emptier chest, having given away the only place in the world that had ever been entirely hers. Seo Jinwoo returned to the hospital 4 days after the war that had frozen his empire finally turned in his favor, his knuckles still bruised, his voice hoarse from things he did not let himself think about in daylight. He had spent those 4 days doing what needed to be done to protect his daughter's future, and he arrived expecting to find Ha-Yun still waiting for a surgery he had no way to pay for. Instead, he found her sitting up in bed, alive, healed, laughing at something on the television bolted to the wall. "She's fine," the doctor told him, watching the disbelief move across his face. "Someone paid. In full. Anonymously." Jinwoo asked every question a man like him knew how to ask. He offered money, threats disguised as gratitude, every resource at his disposal. The hospital staff had nothing to give him. The woman, they said, had been firm about her privacy, had left no name on any form that mattered, had vanished from the building the same day the payment cleared. Whoever she was, she hadn't wanted to be found. He didn't have time to keep looking. The peace he'd bought his organization was fragile, and within a week another attack forced him underground again, this time for good. Not to rebuild what he'd lost, but to dismantle it piece by piece so his daughter would never again be a bargaining chip in someone else's war. He disappeared from the world Naomi had glimpsed only in hospital corridor whispers, and Naomi disappeared from a world that never knew her name to begin with, or her home country, or what she'd given up in it. 2 lives that had touched for one afternoon moved on in opposite directions, each carrying a debt the other didn't know how to repay. 6 years passed the way hard years do, slowly in the living of them, impossibly fast in the looking back. Naomi still worked mornings at a laundromat and evenings cleaning offices after the workers went home, still renting the same single room where the radiator rattled and the window didn't quite close. Hard years had left her tired, with new lines around her eyes and aching feet, but they hadn't taken away her warmth or the gentle softness of her frame. She had nothing left of Enugu but a faded photograph of her parents' kitchen window and a cousin's voice on the phone twice a year, and still, on the hardest nights, she never let herself regret it. Somewhere out there, she told herself, a little girl was alive because of a phone call made with shaking hands. That had to be worth something, even on the nights it didn't feel like enough, even on the nights she missed a home she could no longer go back to. Jinwoo, meanwhile, had become someone almost unrecognizable to the man who once ran from safe house to safe house with his daughter asleep in his arms. He had built, from the wreckage of everything he'd walked away from, one of Korea's most respected private security firms, legitimate, clean, the kind of company that made him wealthy in ways he no longer had to hide. But no boardroom success had ever quieted the one question that followed him for 6 years. Who was the woman who had saved his daughter, and why had she never let him thank her? He had searched. Quietly, thoroughly, the way he did everything. Old hospital contacts, retired staff, records that should not have existed anymore. Every lead ended in the same place, a woman who had wanted, more than anything, to disappear. Ha-yoon, 12 now, had never let the question rest either. She remembered almost nothing about her surgery, but she remembered a voice, a song in a language that wasn't Korean, a woman who called her Bear Brave. She had drawn pictures of her for years, a round, kind, dark-skinned face she was terrified of forgetting, and called her, simply, her angel. "Have you found her yet?" she asked her father, at least once a month, every month, for 6 years. It was an old assistant, retiring and clearing out records that should have been destroyed long ago, who finally found what 6 years of searching hadn't, a single form, buried and unsigned in any way that mattered, except for one detail the woman had forgotten to erase, a wire transfer receipt showing funds arriving from Enugu, Nigeria, the same week as the surgery, under the name Naomi Ease. Jin-woo stared at the name for a long time before he understood what he was looking at. Then he pulled every thread that name could lead to, and what he found broke something open in his chest that he had kept sealed for 6 years. A house in Nigeria, sold the same week as the surgery, the only property she owned, the only inheritance her parents had left her, on another continent, in a country she'd left everything to work in. A woman who had gone from having one small anchor to her homeland to having none, who had never filed a complaint, never asked for anything, never once let the world know what she'd given up. She hadn't just paid for his daughter's life. She had paid with the only thing that still connected her to home, and then vanished so he would never feel the weight of it. He found her address within a day. It took him 3 more to decide he was ready to face her. The rain had just started when the convoy of black cars pulled up outside Naomi's building, and she noticed it only because it was the kind of sight that didn't belong on her street. Too clean, too expensive, headlights cutting through a downpour that had sent everyone else inside. She was on her way back from the laundromat, hood up, umbrella broken and useless in her hand, when the door of the first car opened. She recognized the child before she recognized the man. Taller now, hair longer, but the same wide, searching eyes, except this time they weren't clouded with fear. Ha-yoon ran toward her before anyone could stop her, threw both arms around Naomi's waist, and said the only thing that mattered. "I found you. I told him I'd find you." Naomi stood frozen in the rain, one hand still holding her broken umbrella, the other coming up slowly to rest on the girl's head, and it was only then that she let herself look at the man standing a few feet back, watching her with an expression she couldn't name. Something between disbelief and grief and a gratitude too large for his face to hold. "You sold your house," Jin-woo said quietly, not as a question. "In Nigeria. The only thing you had left of your parents." "For her." "She was scared," Naomi said, as if that explained everything, because to her, it did. He told her, there in the rain, what he had spent 6 years trying to say to a stranger he couldn't find. That he would repay her, every one of what she'd lost, the house, the years, the home she could never fully get back, whatever it cost, whatever it took. Naomi shook her head before he'd finished. "I didn't do it so someone would pay me back. If I take your money now, it turns into something it was never supposed to be." It wasn't the answer he expected. He had met men who bent under threats and women who melted at the sight of his wealth, and in 6 years of searching he had never once considered that the woman he found might simply refuse him. Something in his chest shifted, quiet and unfamiliar, as he stood in the downpour looking at a woman who had crossed an ocean, lost everything twice, and wanted even less than she'd lost, and understood, for the first time, that what he owed her could never be settled with a number. If this story touches your heart, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from? I read every comment and I'd love to say hello. Jin-woo offered her the position before the rain on her coat had dried, not out of guilt, he was careful to say, but because he had never met anyone better suited to run something meant to save children. The CO Foundation had existed for years as little more than a name on a tax filing, a formality of the wealthy. Naomi turned it into something else entirely. She sat with frightened parents in hospital waiting rooms the way she'd once sat with Ha-yoon, learned every child's name before she learned their diagnosis, and made sure no family ever had to make the phone call she'd once made to Enugu. Word spread quickly through Seoul's hospitals that there was a woman at the foundation who didn't just write checks, she stayed. Ha-yoon began showing up after school without asking permission, doing homework at the corner of Naomi's desk, declaring to anyone who'd listen that Naomi was the brightest part of growing up. Naomi found herself laughing more than she had in years, sleeping better, standing a little straighter. The ache that had lived in her chest since the night she signed away the house in Enugu didn't disappear, but it softened, made room for something else to grow beside it. She and Jin-woo built their closeness slowly, in the space between board meetings and hospital visits, in the quiet after Ha-yoon fell asleep on the office couch and someone had to carry her to the car. It wasn't romance that drew them together first. It was the shared instinct to protect anyone who couldn't protect themselves, the recognition of a kindred kind of stubbornness. For the first time since she'd boarded a plane out of Nigeria with 2 suitcases and a grief she hadn't finished carrying, Naomi let herself imagine a life that included happiness, not just survival. It didn't last undisturbed. Word of a foreign maid who had somehow become indispensable to Seo Jin-woo reached the wrong ears within months. The remnants of his old world, men who had once feared him, and hated him more for walking away, found in Naomi an easy target. The first threat came as a note slipped under her apartment door: leave him, or he loses more than money next time. She didn't tell Jin-woo. Then came the whispers in boardrooms, careful and deniable, that she'd calculated her way into his life, that a woman like her didn't end up beside a man like him by accident. Old co-workers from the mansion she used to clean laughed about it openly now, saying a maid belonged in the kitchen, not at the head of a foundation bearing his name. Naomi absorbed all of it the way she'd always absorbed cruelty, quietly, without complaint, until the day a second note arrived naming Ha-yoon. That was the one she couldn't carry silently. She decided, alone in her apartment at 2 in the morning, that the only way to keep them safe was to disappear the way she once had from the hospital 6 years ago, before either of them could talk her out of it. She had her bag half packed when Ha-yoon appeared in her doorway, having slipped away from her father's driver, tears streaking her face. "You're leaving," the girl said, not a question. "You always leave when it gets hard. But I found you once. I'll just find you again." Naomi sank to the floor with her, and for the first time in 6 years, let a child see her cry. Jin-woo arrived 20 minutes later, having tracked his daughter's absence to the one place she'd go. He found them both on the floor of a half-packed apartment, and understood everything without being told. He didn't ask Naomi to explain. He simply said, "You're not going anywhere," in a voice that left no room for argument, and for once, Naomi didn't have the strength to refuse him. What followed was not violence, though every instinct from his old life told him it would be simpler. Instead, at a gala meant for his company's investors, Jin-woo stood in front of the same circle of businessmen who'd been whispering about Naomi for months and told them, plainly, that the woman they'd mocked had sold everything she owned to save his daughter's life while he was too powerless to do it himself, that no fortune he'd built since could equal what she'd given for free. The room went silent in the particular way rooms go silent when shame finally has somewhere to land. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. By morning, the rumors had reversed themselves entirely, and it was Naomi's name people spoke with respect. That same week, over a dinner the three of them had started sharing most nights without ever calling it a tradition, Ha-yoon set down her chopsticks and looked at Naomi with an expression far older than her 12 years. "Will you become my mommy someday?" she asked, quiet and hopeful and terrified of the answer. Naomi opened her mouth and found she had no words at all. It was Jin-woo who moved first, reaching across the table and closing his hand gently over hers, not pulling, just present, just there, the way he'd learned, slowly, over 6 years, that love sometimes needed to be offered rather than declared. The last threat took longer to unravel than either of them expected. Jin-woo spent weeks working quietly alongside law enforcement, handing over the names and networks he'd spent 6 years dismantling piece by piece, refusing every opportunity to settle old scores the way his past self would have. When the final arrests came, they came without a single act of retaliation from him. A fact the prosecutor noted publicly, calling it the clearest sign yet that Seo Jin-woo had truly left his old world behind. The threats against Naomi stopped the same week. What she hadn't expected was how the truth would travel once it was finally free to. A journalist covering the arrests uncovered the story of a foreign maid who'd sold her only inheritance to save a mafia boss's daughter, and within days it was everywhere. The house in Enugu, the years of homelessness, the anonymous payment she'd never wanted credit for. The same co-workers who'd once mocked her size and her plainness now struggled to meet her eyes when her photograph appeared in the news. Naomi read the articles once, quietly, and then let them go, along with something heavier she'd been carrying far longer than 6 years. The belief, buried so deep she'd stopped noticing it was there, that she had to earn her place in the world through sacrifice alone. For the first time, she understood she was loved simply for who she was, not for what she'd given up to prove it. 5 years passed the way good years do, quickly, gratefully, each one easier to hold than the last. The bakery Naomi opened with the foundation's support became known throughout the neighborhood not just for the bread, but for the woman behind the counter who always seemed to know which customer needed a second, quieter conversation about something other than pastries. Beside it, she built a smaller foundation of her own, one that found jobs, legal aid, and safe housing for domestic workers far from home, women who reminded her, in 100 small ways, of who she used to be. Life, filled finally with peace and purpose instead of survival, had changed her in ways she hadn't chased and barely noticed. She moved easier, slept deeper, laughed without the old exhaustion behind it. She remained, through all of it, exactly the woman she'd always been underneath, humble, warm, quick to notice anyone in a room who felt invisible. On the anniversary of Ha-Yun's surgery, Jin-woo asked Naomi to close the bakery early for what he called a foundation event. She arrived to find the courtyard full, families she'd helped over the years, children she'd sat with in hospital rooms, staff from the foundation, and Ha-Yun, 17 now, standing beside her father with tears already gathering in her eyes. Jin-woo crossed the courtyard alone, reached into his coat, and knelt in front of everyone she had ever helped, holding a ring he had carried, she would later learn, for almost a year, waiting for the right moment that never quite felt brave enough, until now. "You gave me back my daughter," he said, his voice carrying easily in the sudden hush. "I've spent years learning how to deserve you." Naomi pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, the courtyard blurring through tears, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, let herself simply be happy without waiting for the cost. She said yes before he'd finished asking. Within the year, the three of them opened a children's hospital wing together, not named for the CO fortune, but for the small, quiet act that had started everything. A woman who once sold the only house she had left in the world, certain no one would ever know, certain it wouldn't be enough. It had been enough. It had, in the end, been everything. If this story touched your heart, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from? I read every single one, and I'd love to say hello.